Hi class, this is an introductory video for Unit 2. Unit 2 gives you kind of a list of some very specific things we need to learn, but I find it's much more helpful to learn those things if we start big picture. As I always say, understanding starts in big picture. So in Unit 1, we learned the very basics of argument. We learned we had to evaluate the factual claims and the inferential claims separately. And really, all we did to kind of learn how to make those evaluations is to use just the very general inference question. Assuming the premises were true, would the conclusion follow? Uh, that's fine for obviously good arguments and obviously bad arguments. But critical thinking doesn't involve either of those two things, right? Critical thinking really essentially involves the stuff that we have to think a little more about. And so the goal of Unit 2 is to focus in on these various argument types and talk about what makes them good or bad so that we're in a much better position to evaluate them. So, which arguments are we talking about? First of all, we're not really doing much more with the deductive arguments for the rest of the semester. If you're really interested in determining the precise rules of validity and when we're allowed to make inferences rather than just the counterexample method, that's the formal logic course. If you want to really learn about that stuff, and it's great stuff to talk about, definitely check out the formal logic course. But here, the critical thinking class, we're going to focus on inductive arguments. And recall from Unit 1 that one of the hallmarks of inductive arguments is they admit to scale. They have stronger and weaker, and so there's a lot more nuance and care involved in evaluating the inferential claim, the strength or weakness of an inductive argument. And so the Robinson sets that up a little bit at the beginning of the chapter. So things to watch out for. One, inductive arguments are always defeasible. That is, it's always possible that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, and that's okay, right? That's also remember from Unit 1, there's nothing wrong with induction. 99.99% of our reasoning is inductive. And so what we have to learn is the more nuanced to think in terms of probability. When is it likely or virtually certain or a good guess, any of these, to think the conclusion will follow from the premises. So that's generally on induction. We have to keep that in mind. But also remember, deduction tends to be abstract and definitional. Inductive arguments, we use cause and effect and reasoning about the world. And that's really what's going on kind of behind what Robinson calls the rule of total defense, that we use all our available evidence. So we're reasoning about the world, which means what we know about the world should be part of our evaluation. And what the kind of things we're worried about here is it's very easy to make an argument that sounds good if you ignore certain facts about the world. So let me just give a simple example. Suppose I said, well, violent bank robberies are way up, and so we need to bring back capital punishment in this state. That might start to sound good unless you say, well, wait a minute. Capital punishment isn't used in violent bank robbery. It's specifically used for capital crimes, and all of a sudden that argument just goes kerflooey. And so when we're evaluating arguments, we need to make sure they're good total when we're dealing with induction, that we're not sweeping something under the rug. And that's part of why Robinson brings this up. And it's something we'll see as we go through. So that's big picture what we're doing in Unit 2. We're going to focus then on these inductive arguments. What makes an argument from an analogy an analogy? If we define that, then we could also figure out what makes a good analogy and a bad analogy, how to strengthen our analogies, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to go through all of the different inductive argument types in a lot more detail to kind of move us away from the kiddie table of Unit 1 to much more precise evaluation in Unit 2. Part of that evaluation. So we're going to learn how to make our own arguments and make them well, but part of that means avoiding bad types of reasoning. And this is going to be our unit where we get a list of what are called fallacies. We're going to spend a lot of time on fallacies. Roughly speaking, well, there's some big picture stuff about fallacies. So you've heard the term. Dowden defines fallacies as an error in reasoning. And that's a good definition for reasons we'll talk about, and it does capture all the fallacies we're going to examine. But to understand what's really going on, an alternative definition to fallacies, which isn't as good. So I want to be clear, this is not as good a definition, but it might help us understand what's going on. Another definition of a fallacy is something wrong with an argument besides false premises. That's a common way to do it. Patrick Hurley defines fallacies that way. Now, the problem is there are a couple of fallacies that are just false premises. We'll look at one very soon called a false dilemma, where the arguer presents two options as if they're the only options, when in fact there's lots more. There's middle grounds. Well, that's just a false premise. If you say A or B, not A, therefore B, well, that's a perfect inference, and the problem is a false premise. So why is that called a fallacy? Well, it is an error in reasoning, but it's an error in reasoning not because we don't know the science and we don't realize those are the only two options. It's because there's an agenda, they're trying to persuade you in one way, and it's a very common form of persuasion. So a lot of fallacies, there's kind of a few places fallacies come from. So fallacies can be deliberate. A lot of people know what's a bad argument and they'll put it forward anyway because they're expecting their audience to not know it. Just watching some examples of that on YouTube yesterday. Kind of sad. But a lot of times fallacies are like that. There's also ones where we're so attached to a conclusion or to a worldview, we think that our conclusion is so obviously right that we're a little less careful about how we get to that conclusion. And so if you have kind of an emotional investment, a lot of times you'll not notice when you're reasoning poorly. And so that's another place where fallacies might come from, is just this kind of worldview combined with a little bit of incautiousness as a result, but as a result, it's not deliberate. And then just more generally, a third place fallacies come from is there's just facts of human psychology, that human brains are really complicated. We're not purely rational creatures, as we talked about in Unit 1. And so our brains make these connections that are not justified by reason, but make it sound good. And we'll look at some of those as well. And so fallacies are most often reasons why the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. That is, they're usually just errors in the inference. But more generally, fallacies are just seen as errors in reasoning, and there are very common patterns that these fallacies come up over and over and over again. And so it's helpful to talk about these problems, even if they're not problems of inference in that way. And that's what we're going to do in Unit 2. So in addition to learning these precise argument forms, we're going to learn fallacies, that is, ways inferences go wrong. And we're going to learn them in a few different ways. We're going to try to write our own examples. We're going to try to spot some when other people make it, so that we're better on guard and not doing that in the future. All right, last part of the introductory video. I'm going to try to make some distinctions about fallacies that you might find helpful, just to really kind of focus on where they are and what to look for. And so I don't want to seem like I'm just throwing a bunch of terminology at you, but these distinctions should help in trying to figure out kind of what's going wrong with these reasoning patterns. So the first distinction you'll hear sometimes is the difference between a formal fallacy and an informal fallacy. Formal fallacies we're basically not doing in this course. Formal fallacies are just what makes a deductive argument invalid. That's it. And Again, if you want to learn more about those, take the formal logic course. It's not a coincidence that that's the name. That's where you find formal fallacies. Just an example, affirming the consequent. If A, then B, B, therefore A. That's one we looked at with the counterexample method. If I'm in Ohio, I'm in the U.S., I'm in the U.S., it does not follow that I'm in Ohio. That's just a coincidence. That would be a formal fallacy. Informal fallacies are, roughly speaking, any fallacy besides invalidity. They could still apply to deductive arguments, believe it or not, but any problem besides validity is an informal fallacy. So most often they're where inductive arguments go bad, but there's a couple of other ways deductive arguments can be invalid, or sorry, be fallacious, believe it or not. Example, circular reasoning. If your premises somehow implicitly or explicitly include the conclusion. Well, that certainly makes it deductively valid. A, therefore A is a valid argument, but it's bad reasoning. So, example I hear once in a while, well, God exists, conclusion. We know God exists because it says so in the Bible, premise. We know the Bible is accurate because it was inspired by God, premise. Well, that's certainly a valid argument, but that's because the premises assume the conclusion. That particular justification for why we should think there's a God is viciously circular. If the only reason given to think the Bible is correct is it was inspired by God, we cannot use that evidence to conclude the existence of that being. So that's an example of an informal fallacy. Again, most of the informal fallacies deal with inductive arguments. There's a very few oddballs that deal with deductive. So to summarize, formal fallacies just mean deductive invalidity. Where does it go wrong there? Informal fallacies, anything else, mostly inductive, but a very few odd duck deductives. Odd duck deductives. I shouldn't use that phrase again. It's too hard to say. All right. Another distinction, though, and I think this one will help you a lot more as we're going through materials. It's one of those distinctions that most authors, but not our authors, make at the beginning of the fallacy chapters of their books. This is a difference between a fallacy of relevance and a fallacy of, sometimes called fallacy of support, sometimes called fallacy of weak induction. Well, those two are interchangeable. The difference here, remember, to make an argument inductively strong, it has to be more than, the premises have to make the conclusion more than 50% likely. The fallacies of relevance, roughly speaking, the premises make the conclusion 0% likely because they're not relevant to the conclusion. And we'll look at some fallacies that are like that. But a very common, for instance, is called an ad hominem. You might have heard of it before. This is where the conclusion is rejected not based on the argument, but based on who's giving the argument. So, well, Senator X gives this clear, articulate argument for universal health care. However, we'll have to dismiss that conclusion because he's a Democrat. Well, that's clearly just a cheat. You're not actually addressing the argument. So notice that my conclusion that we should reject universal health care is based on something entirely irrelevant. Who is saying it? That doesn't address their reasons at all. So that's an example of what is called a fallacy of relevance. Again, the fallacies of relevance, the premises do not support the conclusion. They are not relevant to the conclusion. And now, why do people do these? Because they're psychologically relevant. They're not relevant to logic, but they're relevant to how people think. They're relevant to what kind of cheap tricks will work to get to a conclusion. By contrast, the fallacies of support, sometimes called the fallacies of weak induction, are ones that are relevant to the conclusion. They do give you some support, but they don't get you to that 51% threshold. So one of the fallacies we'll look at later is called an appeal to an unqualified authority. Well, somebody's saying it, so that gives us some reason to think it's true, but that someone is not qualified to say it. And so the hallmark of a fallacy of support or weak induction, the premises are relevant. By relevant, I mean add some likelihood to the conclusion, but just not enough. And As we're going through the fallacies, I'll mention on the videos, but try to kind of pay attention because that really helps us understand what's going on. Well, is the problem that it's not adding anything to the conclusion and is just fooling us with human psychology facts? Or is the problem that it's just not enough for us to accept the conclusion? And bearing that in mind, you should find pretty helpful as we're going through. So watch for that distinction as well. Otherwise, the weeks are going to be repetitive in the sense we'll be doing the same thing every week. We'll learn a few argument forms, what makes them good, what makes them bad, what makes them that type of argument. And a lot of the what makes them bads will be introducing these informal fallacies that we need to be aware of because it's so easy to fall for them. So we don't make them ourselves. And so we recognize and reject them when we hear them from others. So that's what's going on in Unit 2.